Dr. Serafina Vale had spent 15 years at TechVantage, pouring her expertise and creativity into the company's success, only to watch others take credit for her work. When she was dismissed, she knew it was not merely a career setback, but an opportunity to reclaim the recognition that had long been denied to her. Within days of her departure, the consequences for TechVantage became painfully clear. The company's flagship product, AccountSphere, relied entirely on the algorithm she had developed, an algorithm that was legally hers because she had designed it on her own time and personal equipment. Without her intellectual property, TechVantage was left with two impossible choices: negotiate a costly licensing deal with her new employer, Precision Systems, or attempt to rebuild the core technology from scratch, a process that would take years and untold millions in development costs. As the market reacted to this crisis, TechVantage's stock plummeted by 7%, while Precision Systems, now benefiting from Serafina's expertise, saw a 12% surge. Technology journals were already calling the situation a strategic coup, requesting interviews with her about the shift that had shaken the accounting software industry. While others might have been overwhelmed by the attention, Serafina felt something she hadn't in years: validation. For over a decade, she had been undervalued, sidelined, and made to feel as though she should be grateful just to have a seat at the table. Now, the industry was finally recognizing her contributions, and it was happening on her terms. As she settled into her new role as Chief Innovation Officer at Precision Systems, Alaric Thorne, a trusted colleague, stopped by her office to check on her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Validated," she responded honestly. At that moment, her new executive assistant appeared at the door, informing her that the development team was ready for her in the main conference room, but hesitated. Before adding that TechVantage's CEO, Magnus Dorn, had called 4 times in the last hour. Serafina, unbothered, instructed her assistant to let him know she was in meetings all day and that TechVantage's legal team could discuss licensing options later that week. It was a stark contrast to the past. Just days ago, Magnus and his executives had dismissed her, assuming she was replaceable. Now, they were realizing just how integral she had been to their success. As Serafina walked toward her first meeting, her phone buzzed with a message from Cassian Rowe, one of her closest allies at TechVantage, who had chosen to follow her to Precision Systems. "Board just called an emergency session. Magnus looks like he's about to explode. P.S. My team and I accept your offer. When can we start?" Serafina smiled. The fallout was happening even faster than expected. By Tuesday morning, the full impact of her departure had become undeniable to everyone at TechVantage. Their development team was in chaos, struggling to figure out how to move forward without her algorithm. Meanwhile, her former team members were preparing to officially join her at Precision Systems, reinforcing the knowledge drain that TechVantage could not afford. Cassian kept her updated, sharing that Magnus had called an all-hands meeting at TechVantage, attempting to reassure employees that they would vigorously defend their proprietary technology. But as soon as someone asked if they had failed to secure the patent, the tension in the room was palpable. Marjorie Thompson, the company's legal head, looked as if she were about to faint. Magnus quickly cut the meeting short, unable to provide any real answers. By Wednesday, the industry fallout had intensified. 2 major clients, worried about the stability of AccountSphere, had already contacted Precision Systems about switching providers. TechVantage's stock had fallen another 8%, while Precision Systems continued to climb. That afternoon, Serafina received a call from Denise, the same HR executive who had handed her a severance package just days earlier. "Dr. Vale, I'm calling to discuss the, situation with your patent. We believe there may have been a misunderstanding about ownership rights." Serafina remained calm. "I don't think there's any misunderstanding," she replied. "My employment agreement clearly states that intellectual property developed on my own time Using my own resources remains mine. The patent documentation confirms that. There was a long pause before Denise sighed. Victor was hoping you might consider coming in to discuss options. Serafina didn't hesitate. Any discussions will need to go through Precision Systems' legal department. I'm sure they'd be happy to set up a meeting to discuss licensing terms. The silence on the other end spoke volumes. By Friday, exactly 1 week after Serafina had left TechVantage, the company was in full crisis mode. Their stock had fallen a total of 23% since Monday, triggering alarm among investors. Industry analysts were publishing speculative reports with headlines like, "Can TechVantage survive the algorithm crisis?" and "How one strategic blunder may cost a tech giant everything." Magnus had finally been forced to acknowledge the severity of the situation to his board, admitting that TechVantage needed to either negotiate a painful licensing deal or attempt to rebuild AccountSphere from scratch without using any of Serafina's patented technology. He publicly claimed they could recreate the functionality in 6 months, but industry experts weren't convinced. Cassian, now preparing for his official transition to Precision Systems, laughed at the claim. The original algorithm took you 3 years to perfect, and that was with intimate knowledge of the problem space. How do they expect to do it in 6 months without you? He said during their Friday video call. Employees at TechVantage weren't buying it either. Many had already updated their LinkedIn profiles, looking for new opportunities. The knowledge drain was proving catastrophic. That afternoon, TechVantage's attorneys finally reached out to Precision Systems to discuss potential licensing arrangements. Their desperation was evident, but Serafina and her legal team had prepared for this moment. They responded with terms that were technically fair, but strategically painful. 3 times the standard industry licensing rate, and a public acknowledgement of Serafina as the algorithm's creator. Reviewing the response, Alaric smirked. They'll balk at the acknowledgement more than the cost. Magnus's ego won't allow him to admit he pushed out the person who created their core technology. Serafina nodded. Then they'll have to rebuild, she said. And every day they spend trying to replicate my work is another day we extend our lead in the market. As TechVantage struggled to contain the crisis of its own making, Dr. Serafina Vale was settling into her new role at Precision Systems with remarkable ease. Unlike the years she had spent at TechVantage, where her contributions had been ignored or outright stolen, here she was not just acknowledged but celebrated. Every idea she proposed was met with genuine engagement. Every strategy she laid out was given careful consideration. And for the first time in her career, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. When she spoke in meetings, executives listened, not because they had to, but because they valued her insight. By the second week of her tenure, the impact of her leadership was already evident. Alaric Thorne, one of Precision Systems' senior executives, met with her for an afternoon briefing and delivered the latest update with a pleased expression. The engineering team has implemented your efficiency improvements. Early testing shows a 51% performance boost, better than even our highest projections. Serafina nodded, unsurprised. I had several refinements I never shared with TechVantage, she admitted. After I found out they were planning to eliminate my position, I saw no reason to give them my best work. Alaric smirked. Their loss, our gain. It wasn't just the internal culture shift that solidified Serafina's confidence in her decision. It was the growing industry-wide recognition that her contributions had been vital all along. As the week unfolded, more clients expressed interest in Precision Systems, eager to explore alternatives to AccountSphere. While TechVantage's leadership still publicly insisted that they could replicate her algorithm in 6 months, behind closed doors, the cracks were widening. Cassian Rowe, Her longtime ally, who had officially resigned from TechVantage to join her at Precision Systems, relayed details of Magnus Dorn's increasingly desperate leadership. "He's losing his grip," Cassian reported during one of their late-night strategy calls. "He stormed out of the last board meeting after investors demanded answers about the licensing negotiations. And Marjorie? She's panicking. She knows this is partly on her." By the end of the second week, TechVantage's stock had fallen nearly 30%, with analysts openly questioning whether the company could survive the algorithm crisis without completely restructuring its leadership. Their legal team, realizing they had no viable path forward, finally approached Precision Systems with an initial licensing inquiry. But they weren't the first. Dataflow Systems, a mid-sized competitor, had already reached out, hoping to preemptively secure rights to Serafina's patented technology before getting caught in the crossfire. The industry was shifting, and the balance of power was now firmly in Serafina's hands. While TechVantage scrambled to contain the damage, Serafina was looking ahead. She assembled her new innovation team, which included Cassian and 5 of her former engineers from TechVantage, all of whom had chosen to leave in favor of working in an environment where their skills would be appreciated. The energy in the room was electric as they began mapping out the next evolution of her algorithm. Anita, one of her former team members, shook her head in disbelief. "This is how development meetings should be. At TechVantage, we spent half our time explaining basic concepts to executives who wouldn't listen anyway." Serafina smiled, knowingly. "That's the difference between being valued and being seen as replaceable. Here, your expertise is recognized." Meanwhile, TechVantage had reached its breaking point. On Monday morning, an emergency board meeting resulted in Magnus Dorn's removal as CEO, effective immediately. The same investors who had once dismissed Serafina as insignificant were now recognizing far too late the cost of their mistake. Marjorie Thompson, along with the head of legal, who had failed to properly secure Serafina's patent, was also forced out. Within hours, the tech industry was buzzing with the news, and for the first time, TechVantage publicly admitted its failure. That evening, Serafina received an unexpected email from Richard Donovan, the newly appointed interim CEO of TechVantage. Unlike the frantic messages from Magnus the week before, this one was composed, respectful, and to the point. "Dr. Vale, congratulations on your new position. I have been brought in to help TechVantage navigate the current situation, and I would like to discuss a fair licensing arrangement for your patented technology. We are prepared to acknowledge your contributions publicly and make appropriate amends for the oversights of previous management. Would you be available to meet next week?" Serafina forwarded the email to Alaric with a simple note. Phase 1. Complete. His reply came swiftly. Beautifully executed. The board is celebrating your first major victory for Precision Systems. Looks like TechVantage is finally learning an expensive lesson about valuing innovation and innovators. 3 months after her departure from TechVantage, Serafina stood on stage at the National Technology Innovation Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. It was a moment of quiet triumph, one she had never imagined for herself a year ago. As she surveyed the crowd of industry leaders, technology journalists, and aspiring developers, she reflected on how much had changed. Just the year before, she had attended the same conference as part of TechVantage's delegation, seated in the back while Magnus took credit for her work. Now, she was the one standing at the podium, introduced as the creator of the distributed processing algorithm that had revolutionized data handling across multiple industries. The applause was substantial as she approached the microphone. "Thank you," she began. "Today, I want to talk about innovation, ownership, and the importance of properly valuing intellectual contributions, regardless of where they come from." Her speech covered the technical aspects of her algorithm, but also touched on the broader industry-wide issue of recognizing and respecting intellectual property. She never once mentioned TechVantage by name, but everyone knew who she was referring to. After the talk, several young female engineers approached her seeking advice. One of them, barely 30, confided in a hushed voice, "Your story changed how I document my work. I started keeping detailed logs of my development process on personal time." Serafina smiled. "Smart. Your innovations deserve protection." As the evening reception wound down, her phone buzzed with an industry news alert. TechVantage had officially announced a licensing agreement with Precision Systems. For the first time, they acknowledged her by name as the algorithm's creator. Their stock had stabilized, though it remained at a significantly lower valuation than before her departure. Precision Systems, on the other hand, was soaring, and Serafina had secured her legacy exactly where it belonged. 1 year after walking out of TechVantage for the last time, Dr. Serafina Vale sat in her spacious corner office at Precision Systems, reviewing the company's latest quarterly innovation report. Under her leadership, Precision Systems had released 3 groundbreaking products, all built upon the distributed processing algorithm she had originally designed, and the results spoke for themselves. Market share had surged, with Precision Systems capturing a substantial portion of TechVantage's former client base. And for the first time in its history, the company had surpassed TechVantage in overall valuation. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Alaric Thorne stepped in, carrying a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses, his expression brimming with satisfaction. "Happy anniversary," he said, setting the glasses down on her desk. "The board asked me to share the news with you personally. Before the public announcement, Precision Systems has officially overtaken TechVantage in market value." Serafina smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph or vengeance. It was a smile of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't pursued this journey for revenge, though many had framed her story that way. What had driven her was something far more meaningful: recognition. The acknowledgement that innovation wasn't a faceless force, that it came from real people with real expertise who deserved real credit. "That's what happens when you value innovation properly," she said simply, watching as Alaric poured the champagne. As they clinked glasses in a quiet toast, Serafina's assistant appeared at the door, holding an envelope with an embossed logo. She handed it over with a knowing smile. "This just arrived for you, Dr. Vale. I think you'll want to see it." Inside the sleek envelope was an invitation to be the keynote speaker at the Women in Technology Leadership Summit. The topic? Owning Your Intellectual Value: How Proper Documentation Changed an Industry. Alaric glanced at the invitation and chuckled. "You've become something of an icon, you know. The story about the executive who didn't recognize what she had until it was gone. TechVantage has become a cautionary tale in corporate boardrooms." Serafina nodded, aware of the ripple effect her story had created across the tech industry. Richard Donovan, TechVantage's new CEO, had wasted no time implementing sweeping changes to how the company recognized and rewarded innovation. Reports indicated that their new intellectual property policies were modeled after the program Serafina had established at Precision Systems, a direct acknowledgement that their previous approach had been a catastrophic failure. Though TechVantage had finally secured a licensing agreement for her algorithm, the damage had already been done. Investors had lost confidence, key clients had defected, and top talent had abandoned the company, unwilling to work in an environment that had so blatantly undervalued its brightest minds. Meanwhile, at Precision Systems, the culture Serafina had cultivated was thriving. Employees felt empowered to push boundaries, knowing their contributions would be recognized and rewarded. That shift wasn't just limited to her company, it was industry-wide. In the past year, discussions surrounding intellectual property protection for developers had intensified. More engineers, particularly women and underrepresented innovators, were taking steps to document their contributions, ensuring that their work couldn't be erased, stolen, or co-opted by executives who failed to see their worth. One such engineer, a young woman in her early 30s, had approached Serafina at the National Technology Innovation Conference just months earlier. "Your story changed how I document my work," she had admitted in a hushed but determined voice. "I started keeping detailed logs of my development process on personal time. I even consulted with a lawyer about filing a provisional patent for one of my projects." Serafina had smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Smart. Your innovations deserve protection." As she sat in her office now, reflecting on the past year, Serafina realized that this was the true victory, not just the downfall of tech. As Dr. Serafina Vale sat in her office, the weight of the past year settled over her, not as a burden, but as a quiet, resolute satisfaction. The transformation that had once seemed impossible had unfolded with an inevitability she had long suspected, but never dared to assume. She had not only redefined her own career, but had also reshaped an entire industry's approach to innovation. The invitation to the Women in Technology Leadership Summit lay open on her desk, a symbol of how far she had come. It was not the first invitation she had received, nor would it be the last. Over the past year, she had become a sought-after speaker, an industry figurehead, and an advocate for intellectual property protections for developers. But what meant more to her than any speaking engagement was the way companies had begun to rethink how they valued the very people who built their products. Across the tech world, companies were rewriting their policies, tightening protections for engineers, and ensuring that inventors were properly credited for their breakthroughs. Even those who once dismissed such efforts as unnecessary bureaucracy were starting to recognize that the future of innovation depended on empowering the minds behind the technology. TechVantage had learned this lesson the hard way. Richard Donovan, the company's new CEO, had reached out once again, this time not to negotiate licensing fees, but to request a private meeting. The message was straightforward. "Dr. Vale, I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss potential collaborations between TechVantage and Precision Systems. I believe there is a way forward that benefits both companies. Let me know if you'd be open to a conversation." Serafina leaned back in her chair, considering the request. A year ago, such a message would have been unthinkable. TechVantage had seen itself as untouchable, its leadership unwilling to acknowledge the contributions of those who made the company's success possible. Now the balance of power had shifted completely. They were no longer dictating terms. They were seeking partnerships, and they were doing so on her terms. She picked up her phone and dialed Alaric Thorne's extension. A moment later, his voice came through, steady and amused. "Tell me you're not actually considering entertaining their offer." Serafina smirked. "It depends on what they're bringing to the table." A pause, then a chuckle. "You really are enjoying this, aren't you?" She didn't deny it. It wasn't about vengeance, it never had been. But there was a distinct sense of justice in watching the company that had once dismissed her now scrambling to rebuild a bridge they had so carelessly burned. Alaric sighed. "Well, if you do take the meeting, just remember, you hold all the leverage now." She did, and she intended to use it wisely. The following week, Serafina arrived at the TechVantage headquarters for the first time since she had walked out a year prior. The contrast was striking. Where once she had been undervalued, now every step she took through the building commanded respect. Employees who had once overlooked her contributions now watched her with a mix of admiration and trepidation. In the executive boardroom, Richard Donovan greeted her with measured professionalism. He wasted no time with pleasantries. "Let's talk about the future." For the next hour, they discussed what collaboration could look like. Not a return to the past, but a new kind of partnership. one built on acknowledgement, respect, and proper attribution. By the time she left, the agreement was clear. TechVantage would license her algorithm on Precision Systems terms, and in exchange, the two companies would explore joint ventures that capitalized on their respective strengths. This May. Final stipulation: TechVantage would officially acknowledge her role in developing the technology that had built their empire. It was more than just a contract clause. It was a statement to the industry, a declaration that innovators could not be erased. As Serafina stepped out into the crisp evening air, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for every developer, engineer, and innovator who had ever been told their contributions were secondary. The future of technology had changed, and this time, the people behind the breakthroughs would no longer be invisible.